My husband told me his parents died in a car accident before I ever met him. Last month, I received a letter addressed to him from a woman claiming to be his mother, and she was very much alive. I'm 36. Married to Daniel for 9 years. From the very beginning of our relationship, Daniel told me a painful story about losing both parents in a car accident when he was 19, an experience he said shaped his independence and self-reliance, explaining why he never mentioned extended family, never celebrated holidays with anyone beyond the two of us, and always grew quietly distant whenever conversations turned toward childhood memories or family history. I respected his boundaries completely, never pushing him to discuss painful details he clearly preferred leaving buried in the past. We built our own life together, our own traditions, and, honestly, I rarely thought much about his family history beyond that tragic origin story he'd shared early in our relationship. Last month, sorting through mail while Daniel traveled for a work conference, I found a handwritten letter addressed directly to him, no return address, but a name signed at the bottom that made my hands go completely cold. Love always, Mom. I sat with that letter for nearly 2 hours before finally opening it, telling myself repeatedly that this had to be some kind of mistake, perhaps intended for a different Daniel entirely. The letter's contents made that impossible to believe. Whoever wrote it referenced specific childhood memories, a golden retriever named Buster Daniel apparently had growing up, a specific address in Ohio, and expressed desperate hope that Daniel might finally respond after years of unanswered attempts to reconnect. I felt my entire understanding of my husband's history fracture instantly. Either this was an elaborate, cruel prank, or Daniel had fabricated his parents' deaths entirely, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I spent 3 sleepless nights before Daniel returned home, researching everything I could about his supposed hometown in Ohio, eventually finding public records that made my stomach drop entirely. There was no record of a fatal car accident matching his story from that time frame. Instead, I found something else, a woman named Patricia Hartwell, currently 61 years old, living in that exact town, with public records showing a son named Daniel Hartwell, born the same year as my husband. When Daniel finally arrived home, I placed the letter directly in front of him without saying a word, watching every trace of color drain from his face as he recognized the handwriting immediately. He sat down heavily, and after a long, painful silence, began explaining a history far more complicated than the simple tragedy he'd told me for 9 years. Daniel's actual childhood, he explained through visible anguish, had been dominated by his mother Patricia's severe, untreated bipolar disorder, creating an unpredictable, often frightening household environment throughout his entire childhood and teenage years. During manic episodes, Patricia would make impulsive, sometimes dangerous decisions, once nearly bankrupting their family through reckless spending, another time disappearing for nearly 2 weeks without explanation, leaving teenage Daniel to fend for himself entirely. During depressive episodes, she'd become nearly non-functional for weeks at a time, unable to work, barely leaving her bedroom, forcing Daniel to essentially parent himself and manage the household from an alarmingly young age. His father, he explained, had left when Daniel was only 7, unable to cope with Patricia's condition himself, leaving Daniel entirely alone navigating his mother's illness without any other adult support system. At 19, following one particularly severe manic episode where Patricia had made threats that genuinely frightened him regarding his own safety, something he still struggled discussing in detail even now, Daniel made the difficult decision to completely sever contact, moving across the country, changing how he presented himself socially, and eventually constructing the simpler, less complicated narrative of parents who died in an accident, finding it easier than repeatedly explaining his mother's ongoing mental illness and their painful estrangement. He explained he genuinely believed, or perhaps desperately wanted to believe, that complete severance was the only way to build a stable, healthy life for himself, one not constantly disrupted by his mother's unpredictable episodes or the complicated grief of loving someone whose illness made consistent connection nearly impossible. I sat there absorbing this completely different history, understanding my husband hadn't lied out of malice or deception for personal gain, but had constructed a protective narrative around genuine, significant childhood trauma he'd never fully processed or healed from, choosing avoidance over the complicated, painful work of addressing his mother's mental illness and their fractured relationship directly. I asked Daniel directly what he wanted to do now that his mother had clearly been trying to reach him. He admitted feeling completely overwhelmed, caught between old protective instincts telling him to maintain distance, and a quieter, persistent curiosity about whether his mother had gotten help, whether reconciliation might be possible after all these years. We decided together to consult with a family therapist who specialized in estrangement and family mental health dynamics, wanting professional guidance before making any significant decisions about potentially reconnecting with Patricia after 17 years of complete silence. Through several sessions, Daniel began processing decades of complicated trauma, guilt, and grief he'd never properly addressed, understanding that his elaborate false narrative about his parents' death had actually been protecting himself from confronting difficult, unresolved feelings rather than genuinely representing acceptance or closure. After nearly 2 months of careful consideration and therapeutic preparation, Daniel decided to respond to his mother's letter, initially through a carefully worded written response rather than immediate direct contact, wanting to understand her current situation before considering any deeper reconnection. Patricia's response revealed she had, in fact, finally received proper psychiatric treatment 8 years earlier, following a serious crisis that ultimately led to hospitalization and, crucially, an accurate diagnosis and consistent, effective medication management that had stabilized her condition significantly. She expressed profound regret about Daniel's childhood, acknowledging specific incidents he described to us, taking genuine responsibility rather than minimizing or deflecting blame. Exactly the kind of accountability that gave Daniel enough confidence to consider deeper engagement. Over the following months, Daniel and Patricia began slowly rebuilding communication, starting with careful, therapist-guided phone calls, eventually progressing toward an emotional, tentative in-person meeting that Daniel asked me to attend alongside him for support. That meeting was unlike anything I expected, watching my husband, someone I'd known as remarkably composed and self-contained throughout our entire marriage, break down, completely reuniting with a mother he genuinely mourned as dead for 17 years, despite knowing she was somewhere alive during that entire time. Patricia, visibly stable and clearly working an ongoing recovery process, apologized repeatedly, not making excuses for her illness, but acknowledging the genuine impact her untreated condition had on Daniel's entire childhood and their relationship, exactly the accountability that allowed genuine healing to begin. The reconciliation process has continued carefully over the past several months, Daniel and Patricia rebuilding trust incrementally, working through complicated emotions with continued professional support rather than expecting instant, complete healing after such significant, prolonged estrangement. I've watched my husband transform throughout this process, gradually releasing years of carried guilt and protective avoidance, slowly allowing himself to grieve his difficult childhood properly rather than burying it beneath a simpler, false narrative that ultimately prevented genuine healing. Last month, Patricia visited our home for the first time, meeting our own children for the first time as their grandmother, an emotional, carefully paced introduction that represented genuine progress after nearly 2 decades of complete separation. Daniel and I have talked extensively about why he felt he needed to fabricate his parents' deaths rather than simply explaining estrangement honestly. He explained the false narrative felt simpler, avoiding complicated questions or explanations about mental illness that he worried people, including me, might not fully understand or might use to judge either him or his mother unfairly. I've reassured him repeatedly that understanding his actual history, complicated and painful as it genuinely is, has only deepened my love and respect for him, understanding the remarkable resilience it took building a stable, loving life despite such a genuinely difficult, unpredictable childhood. If you discovered your spouse had fabricated a simpler story about painful family history rather than explaining complicated estrangement honestly, would understanding their reasons help you process the initial shock of discovering the deception? Or would the fabrication itself feel like an unforgivable breach of trust regardless of the underlying pain that caused it? Let me know what you think in the comments below.